Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and realizing that you are no longer in your room. That's what happened to Carlos Alberto Diaz in Botucatu in 1981. Without control of his own body, he was guided to an empty lot where a silent spaceship awaited him, and three beings with completely black eyes watched him and led him. Inside, they conducted experiments on Carlos, showed him terrifying visions, and transmitted a direct message to his mind. Tell them we are watching. Tell them that time is running out. Carlos came back hours later with a mark on his forehead, the clock magnetized, and evidence that to this day no one has been able to explain. This is one of the scariest abduction accounts in Brazil.
What would you do if you woke up in the middle of the night and realized you weren't in your bed anymore? What if you found yourself paralyzed, staring up at beings that shouldn't exist, in a place that defied all logic? Tonight, I'm taking you to Brazil, to the year 1981, to tell you about one of the most disturbing alien abduction cases ever documented in South America. A case that left physical evidence, multiple witnesses, and a man forever changed. This is the story of Carlos Alberto Diaz and the night he was taken.
Carlos Alberto Diaz was a simple bus driver living in Botucatu, a quiet city in São Paulo state, Brazil. He was 39 years old, married, with children. By all accounts, he was just an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. But on the night of December 4th, 1981, everything changed. Carlos had finished his shift early that evening. He came home, had dinner with his family, watched some television, and went to bed around 10 p.m. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. His wife, Maria, fell asleep beside him. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was peaceful. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., Carlos woke up. Now here's where things get strange. Carlos didn't wake up because of a noise. He didn't wake up because he had to use the bathroom. He woke up because he felt like something was calling him. He described it as an overwhelming compulsion, an irresistible urge to get out of bed and go outside. He tried to resist it. He tried to stay in bed, but his body wouldn't listen. Carlos found himself getting dressed, almost in a trance-like state. He put on his clothes mechanically, like he was being controlled. His wife didn't stir. She didn't wake up, even though Carlos later said he tried to shake her, tried to call out to her. Nothing worked. And then he walked out of his house, leaving the door unlocked behind him.
Carlos walked down the empty street, completely alone in the pre-dawn darkness. He later described feeling like a puppet on strings, moving but not in control. He walked for about 10 minutes until he reached an empty lot near a construction site on the outskirts of town. And that's when he saw it. Hovering about 15 feet above the ground was an object, not a plane, not a helicopter, something else. Carlos described it as dome-shaped, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with a metallic surface that seemed to shimmer and change colors. Blue, then silver, then an iridescent purple. It made no sound, absolutely no sound at all. And beneath it, standing in the lot, were three beings. They were short, Carlos estimated about 4.5 feet tall. Their heads were disproportionately large for their bodies. Their skin was grayish-white, almost luminescent in the darkness. But what haunted Carlos the most were their eyes.
And then he started floating. Carlos felt himself lifted off the ground, rising slowly toward the craft. He could see everything, his eyes darting around in panic, but his body remained rigid, unmoving. He floated up, and then through an opening that appeared in the bottom of the object. The last thing he saw before entering was the empty street below him, the streetlights looking so small and far away.
What happened next is where this case gets truly disturbing. Carlos found himself in a circular room with curved walls that glowed with a soft white light. There was no visible source of the light. The walls themselves seemed to be luminous. The three beings were there with him, moving around with purpose. Carlos was placed, or perhaps floated, onto some kind of examination table. It wasn't metal or plastic or anything he could identify. It felt almost organic, like it was alive, adjusting to the contours of his body. And then the examination began. One of the beings produced what looked like a small device, about the size of a pen, and began moving it over Carlos's body. Wherever the device passed, Carlos felt a tingling sensation, like pins and needles, but more intense. The beings communicated with each other, but not with words. Carlos heard nothing, but he could sense information being exchanged between them, like they were connected to each other mentally. Then came the part Carlos would never forget. One of the beings approached with another instrument, this one slightly larger, with a crystalline tip that glowed with a blue light. Without warning, the being pressed it against Carlos's forehead, right between his eyes.
Carlos said the pain was instantaneous and overwhelming, like someone had driven a spike directly into his brain. But he still couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but endure it. And then he saw things. Images flooded his mind, flashes of scenes he didn't understand, cities that looked nothing like any place on Earth, beings similar to his captors but in different environments, strange symbols and geometric patterns, and something else, something that terrified him more than anything. He saw Earth from space, and he saw destruction, fire, chaos. He couldn't tell if it was the past, the present, or the future, but the images were vivid and horrifying. The being removed the device, and the vision stopped. Carlos was gasping for air, his heart pounding, sweat pouring down his face. The being stepped back, and then that voice in his head again. "You have been selected. You will remember what you need to remember. Tell them we are watching. Tell them time is running out."
The next thing Carlos knew, he was standing back in the empty lot. The craft was gone. The beings were gone. He was alone in the darkness. But something was wrong. Very wrong. When Carlos checked his watch, it was 5:47 a.m. Over 3 hours had passed, but to him, it felt like maybe 30 minutes. Where had the time gone? He stumbled home, disoriented and terrified. When he burst through the door, Maria woke up, startled. She hadn't even realized he was gone. Carlos tried to explain what happened, but the words came out jumbled and frantic. Maria thought he was having some kind of mental breakdown. She wanted to call a doctor. But then she noticed something. On Carlos's forehead, right between his eyes, was a mark. A small, perfectly circular burn mark, about the size of a coin. It was red, slightly raised, and hot to the touch. That mark would remain visible for weeks.
Carlos reported his experience to the local authorities the next day. Unlike many abduction cases, the police actually took him seriously, mainly because of the physical mark on his forehead and his obviously distressed state. A local ufologist, Professor João Martins, investigated the case extensively. He found several interesting pieces of corroborating evidence. First, 3 other residents in Carlos's neighborhood reported seeing strange lights in the sky around 2 a.m. that same night. They didn't come forward until after Carlos's story became public. Second, at the empty lot where Carlos claimed to have been taken, investigators found unusual ground markings, 3 circular depressions arranged in a triangle pattern, each about 6 inches deep. The soil in these depressions was found to have higher than normal radiation levels, though not dangerously high. Third, and perhaps most compelling, Carlos's watch had stopped at 2:17 a.m. and never worked again. When examined by a watchmaker, the internal components were found to be magnetized in an unusual pattern that couldn't be easily explained. But the most lasting effect was on Carlos himself. After the incident, he began experiencing vivid nightmares. He would wake up screaming, seeing those black eyes staring at him. He developed an intense phobia of the dark and would leave all the lights on in his house at night. He also claimed to have developed what he called knowing. Sometimes he would suddenly know things he had no reason to know. He would predict phone calls before they came. He would know when something bad was about to happen to someone. His family confirmed these strange abilities, though skeptics argued it was just coincidence or heightened anxiety making him hyper-aware.
Carlos Alberto Diaz never sought fame or money from his experience. In fact, he mostly avoided talking about it in later years. He returned to his job as a bus driver and tried to live a normal life. But that mark on his forehead remained for 3 months before slowly fading. And according to those who knew him, Carlos was never quite the same man after that night. Professor Martins continued to investigate the case for years, and it remains one of the most well-documented alien abduction cases in Brazilian history. Yet, it's virtually unknown outside of South America. So what really happened to Carlos Alberto Diaz that night in 1981? Was he truly taken aboard an extraterrestrial craft? Were those beings real? Or was it all an elaborate hallucination? The physical evidence suggests something genuinely anomalous occurred. The multiple witnesses, the ground markings, the radiation readings, the mark on his forehead that doctors couldn't explain. But perhaps the most compelling evidence is Carlos himself, a simple, honest man with no history of mental illness or dishonesty, who stuck to his story for the rest of his life, even when it would have been easier to recant. Whatever happened that night in Botucatu, it left its mark, literally and figuratively. What do you think? Could Carlos Alberto Diaz really have been abducted? Or is there another explanation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Brazil's most mysterious alien encounters, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We explore cases like this every week, diving into the paranormal stories that mainstream media won't touch. Thanks for watching, and remember, keep your eyes on the skies.